session of integrating locally led adaptation to National Adaptation MEL systems as part of the Gobeshona Global Conference 3. I hope everyone has had a great conference so far. We're just getting started and looking forward to a long, fruitful week at the conference here. So this session is hosted by the Adaptation Action Coalition Secretariat, which is housed at World Resources Institute. A little bit about the AAC is it's a coalition of over 40 members committed to mobilizing action on climate change adaptation. And in particular, it's a global hub for peer-to-peer learning, knowledge exchanges with a focus on implementation of adaptation action, and of course, monitoring and evaluation now. So as more countries are submitting their updated NDCs and national adaptation plans, the global focus is now, we find that it's shifting from planning to implementation, as well as the monitoring, which is something that many countries are starting to work on and build on as we speak currently. So these conversations around monitoring, evaluation, and learning has become increasingly important and timely, and sharing knowledge and best practices has become very relevant for a lot of countries and stakeholders as we scale up, action and as well and progress and implementation of adaptation action. And in line with the theme of this the conference this year, which is monitoring locally led adaptation, today's event will focus on an open multi-stakeholder dialogue between various adaptation policy experts. So we have a wonderful panel of experts from Fiji, Japan, and South Africa, each coming from very different, climate, political contexts, as well as institutional backgrounds, as we will introduce shortly our panelists. And they'll be providing an overview on their ongoing national and regional initiatives that aim to integrate not just adaptation in monitoring evaluation, but locally led adaptation as well into the tracking of adaptation action. So after we hear from our panelists, we will have a discussion among us, a close discussion to discuss some of the challenges that they have come up so far, as well as lessons learned from their experiences, and also some insights on scaling locally led adaptation to the national and regional levels. And then finally, we'll open up the floor to open Q&A discussion, where we will encourage the audience to submit any questions on the chat, or simply raise your hand to and open your mic to have a open conversation about this. And then we'll close, and the moderator will close by highlighting some key takeaways, what's most needed, and some concrete action steps at the end. And now I'd like to present to you our moderator today, Ms. Rohini Kohli. She is a Senior Technical Advisor on Climate Change Adaptation Policy and Planning of the UN Development Program. And she works also as part of the UNDP's Nature and Climate Energy Cluster and in the Bureau of Policy and Program Support, and is part of the UNDP's Global Policy Network. Rohini has worked for over 18 years on issues related to poverty, environment, gender, and climate change, with a specific focus on data, policy, and planning. So without further ado, Rohini, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thanks very much, Kyomi, and a warm welcome to, I think, all our panelists and also the audience. I hope looking forward to a very interactive session. So as mentioned, I work on adaptation policy and planning, which is mostly, at the national level. And I think that's the level where governments are building their national systems for adaptation, planning, monitoring, and evaluation. But also, as the focus of this session suggests, we're actually looking at the engagement of local actors in monitoring and evaluation and learning systems, and some of the sort of good practices or emerging experiences of how locally led action is informing the space on monitoring, evaluation, and learning. What are some of the also barriers, and how those are being overcome? So there is a focus at also at the national level of how non-state actors are engaging in the monitoring and evaluation learning processes on adaptation, but specifically also how at between the subnational and national level, how this interaction is taking place. So we're going to hear from our speakers. They'll be providing their overall perspective, and then we will also have an interactive session after that. And we're going to look at both the national and subnational scale, also look at what some of the opportunities for scaling up locally led adaptation action in terms of vertical integration and the expansion for of tracking and the evidence base of locally led action in adaptation monitoring and learning, and then think of some of the key takeaways for and best practices, enabling conditions, and the next steps. So this is a highly relevant discussion to both the national adaptation plans and the nationally determined contributions. The latter have now prioritized adaptation in a majority of countries' NDCs. But I think it's still an open question as to how locally, how much involvement there is of local actors in the implementation phase of these NDCs and the NAPs. So I'm very sort of pleased to say we have a very, very interesting panel today. And I'm going to actually turn to our first panelist. It's Ms. Lembaya Lelaite Gaunavinaka, who's an in-country expert on GIS and remote sensing for Fiji as part of UNITAR UNOSAT, and is based at the Fiji Climate Change Office. She has over 15 years of experience in GIS and Earth observation, remote sensing applications, and holds and also supporting climate change portfolios, renewable energy programs, and disaster preparedness and response. She holds a master's in environmental science from Hokkaido University in Japan, and has served several sectors in various capacities within government, regional, international organizations prior to her role within Fiji's Climate Change Office. So I'm going to actually turn to her for her presentation on and her perspective on this subject. So over to you, Ms. Lemba.
Okay. Is the audio coming across loud and clear?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Once again, thank you for having me on. In this presentation, I will firstly introduce by giving a bit of background on Fiji's key climate change instruments or legislative documents that guide our work with adaptation and locally led adaptation initiatives. So these frameworks essentially, set the scene and drive activities for implementing this on the ground. And I will share some examples of locally led initiatives and their corresponding monitoring, evaluation, and learning frameworks, highlighting the NAP, the National Adaptation Plan, our current review of the NAP costing methodology that we now have in place, and the monitoring and evaluation framework, a National Adaptation Registry, which will collate data and make the monitoring and evaluation process a bit easier to have like a bit of details, granular level details from the sectors on how a NAP is being implemented. And that information is going to be registered in our National Adaptation Registry, as well as our Adaptation Impact Analysis tool. And I will also touch on planned relocation guidelines, the standard operating procedure that's subsidiary to the guidelines, as well as the monitoring and evaluation framework part of Fiji's planned relocation work. So, of course, now with this changing climate and rising temperatures, devastating extremes of weather becoming ever more common, and Fiji being one of the seats at the forefront of these climate impacts, the Fijian government has put in place a couple of these legislative frameworks that guide our ambitious climate change actions. So these legislative instruments all helps to establish an enabling environment that's needed to allow our climate change division and our sectoral stakeholders to drive these activities that essentially it's designed to help our most climate impacted communities and build resilience. And the monitoring and evaluation learning framework and structures that are embedded in these processes helps us continually refine these efforts to ensure they are functional, they are relevant and sustainable. So foremost, we have a Climate Change Act that was established in 2021. This really gives us legislative teeth in being able to implement these targets in the sectors. And then we have the climate change policy, which outlines like what these targets are and how it links up with all the other ministerial legislations and portfolios and priorities. All of this is linked to our national development plan. And then we have our work streams. So we have the locally led adaptation initiatives coming under our adaptation stream. The National Adaptation Plan is in place to guide these efforts. We have 160 measures that's defined across 10 sectors. This ensures like a horizontal mainstreaming across these 10 sectors, as well as vertical integration into the ministries, the respective ministries that are expected to implement these initiatives. And other key instruments to note is the Plan Relocation Guidelines that was launched at COP24 in 2018, and then we have the displacement guidelines launched in 2019. We have a NAP framework and a climate vulnerability risk assessment framework. And the other related instruments also help support these initiatives. The ones under mitigation, our management of our oceans and marine space, as well as what's outlined as Fiji's priorities in our national climate finance strategy. So it outlines in the adaptation portfolio what are Fiji's priorities right now, what are the priority initiatives that we would want partners to help support, what is the government currently prioritizing. It also outlines the status of these activities and where the gaps are, what partners can come on board to help further support to progress this work. So that's in terms of the guidelines. You can log into the Fiji Climate Change portal to look at more details around that. Now, just to put into perspective the institutional arrangements, the National Adaptation Plan sits within the framework of this legislative. This is the current institutional map, and that's where our NAP comes in. And what I mentioned before, we have 10 sectors. So 5 sectors is targeting the systemic changes, systemic components. So the main message, I guess, here is that it's not only about evaluating exposure to current and future expected climate change, but there are also systemic issues which inhibit the ability to deal with this climate change. So this is what we try to address in the targeted measures that's outlined in the systemic components, the 5 sectors under that part of the NAP. One of it being the data that's needed to effectively monitor and be able to clearly justify the climate rationale for the gaps that still exist, for what needs reinforcements, what needs strengthening to be able to achieve the targets that we have set in place. So, for example, climate information and data is critical, allowing us to develop the various scenarios, and based on the various scenarios, we can see the various impacts and how they're going to affect the various sectors that impact economic productivity. So from that, we can develop effective strategies that deal with the impacts under the NAP process. Systemic components tackle adaptation barriers. The actual specific barriers for Fiji has been established through a series of literature review, stakeholder consultations and validation workshops, and interviews with civil society and other broader group of stakeholders. For the sector focus, the key areas for concern for the Fijian government, medium to long term, is to identify important economic and social sectors. So the climate sensitive sectors and what the priorities look like and how we can better coordinate at the local and community level to try to build more resilience. So we sought to identify the threats posed by climate change identified by these existing, national level policies and development planning documents. So here we have the food and nutrition security, health, human settlements, infrastructure, biodiversity, and natural environment. We are at the moment also reviewing our building code legislations to upgrade it to be able to enforce, especially in the urban and peri-urban areas where government has more control to require compliance to a certain standard of housing type, so that we, to minimize the damage that recurring damages and rebuilding efforts that happens a lot in Fiji and the Pacific, that's constantly affected by cyclones. So this is one of the areas where you're investing in reducing vulnerabilities and improving coping capacities. In terms of the NAP M&E framework, we have a review of our NAP that's just completed. We have a NAP M&E framework that was launched in 2020, but it essentially provides it's like an overarching guidance on how we should monitor the progress of NAP implementation in the sectors. And that's an ongoing work. The actual monitoring and evaluation is something that is ongoing. We've instituted a framework, and now it's actually like, because now we have the Climate Change Act of 2021, we are establishing a focal point network across all the ministries, and these focal points will be tapped on and work closely with the climate change division to ensure that they are reporting on how well the NAP and other guiding instruments are being implemented in the sectors and what areas they need more support in terms of implementation. We have a National Adaptation Registry. We've just completed the design phase. The next step would be the actual development of the registry. Of course, that information that's basically defining what the user needs, the operations of the national registry, what functions it needs to perform, and the content that it's going to host, the inventory of past and previous adaptation work, and how highlighting ongoing initiatives, how these will all help feed into the monitoring of how well we are going with our adaptation efforts. Then we have an adaptation impact analysis tool. The goal is to learn from the past and preparing for the future. So this is not, it's different from the M&E framework. It's not exactly an M&E tool, but it's something that complements the M&E tool. The impact analysis database, essentially, you pick an adaptation measure that's been implemented at least 3 to 5 years already, and then you will evaluate. So the evaluators go into these communities where the adaptation project has been done, and then you evaluate how impactful it has been to the intended beneficiary community. Yeah? So it involves a bit of GIS, a bit of a survey, questionnaire survey, and focus group questionnaire surveys to bring in this granular level detail and feed that back into the form that then is ingested back into the database to calculate the impact. So this is sort of like to be able to enable us to capture like the investment value of all the adaptation work that we're doing in the communities, how much it has actually benefited the intended community, so we can learn from all these past adaptation projects that we are evaluating and how better things can be done in the future. So at the moment, like this year, we've got 4 sites for adaptation profiling under this initiative. We've got the floodgates that was constructed in Baku village in Tailevu, a nature-based solution seawall sites, and a multiple coastal protection project that's happening in one of the outer islands, one of the villages as well, where they're constantly impacted by the high tidal waves, and there's a continuous. So they've constructed seawalls and those things are in place, but it's constantly eroding due to the constant, the strong attrition factor as well doesn't allow for certain mangroves to grow and protect these villages as intended. So there's all these things that we need to measure. So another thing that we have is initiatives to monitor the ongoing adaptation projects. So we have our GIS and Earth observation decision support tools to support the monitoring of these activities that's happening in the communities. We overlay certain hazards that we have captured data on. For example, the susceptibility to sea level rise, susceptibility to coastal inundation for communities that are needing seawalls, and evaluate the urgency of the requests that we're getting, and do donor coordination with bilateral partners to try to support this initiative. This is led by the Ministry of Waterways, and they work closely with the Climate Change Office to coordinate on and enhance bilateral support, and as well as local funds on philanthropic funders that may want to adopt one of these communities and help finance and construct these interventions on the ground. So, of course, community consultation is an important part of this process to obtain consent and discuss with communities, as well the community contributions that they would volunteer. Normally, community contributions in the form of labor, they will assist during construction, or in the form of raw materials that they have that can assist, like boulders that can help with the nature-based solutions. Also, they can designate a piece of land where we can grow nurseries and then transplant it to the foreshore, and those kind of things. And then Fiji has a local coordination channel of communication already in place since decades, where requests come through the divisional officers, and then it comes up to the provincial administrator, and then to the divisional commissioners before it comes to the climate change office. So when we are responding to these communities, it has had a few filters that the teams in the divisions have inspected, have done the preliminary analysis, have confirmed that these cases are legit, and then we come in and do the climate vulnerability risk assessments and find support that can go towards these efforts. So it's altogether like a couple of government working with stakeholders as well as other partners that can come on board to support. Once approvals have been obtained and the relevant protocols, traditional protocols are done, we can proceed to the technical work, and that of course brings in the drone surveys to generate DSM for each village, and then we do collect other baseline information on which ones are the impacted buildings and households within the demarcated risk zones. And then full assessments brings in these geotagged photos of the impacted areas, the biodiversity assessment, socioeconomic assessments, and comprehensive risk vulnerability assessments, which are then fed into the database to help us monitor and to help inform our high-level decision makers. So very quickly, these are some of the work that's done in the communities. Sometimes it's just a matter of the seawall has just eroded over time. You can see that one. So it's a 10-year-old seawall. So this is where the beach is now. That was where it was before. So like over here, you can see the 1982 seawall was here. The 1995 seawall is there. And then it just keeps retreating the shoreline. And then we validate that with satellite imageries. We also have this coastal inundation app from UNICEF that helps to look at the impact on critical assets, critical infrastructure, the impact of this coastal inundation. The other work is planned relocation. We have 6 communities that have planned relocation for Fiji. It's a last resort measure. It's only undertaken in cases where you don't find any other feasible adaptation option for the community, and there's a process that's now set in place using a standard operating procedure to assess and determine whether a community still has some adaptation measure that we see that can prolong the need to relocate or potentially avoid the need to relocate, or in the absence of any such measure that we may have to proceed with the measure of last resort, which is relocation. So far, we've relocated 6 communities at the cost of 3.6 million Fijian dollars. So we're looking at a couple of other communities that's in line, but we'll do that one community at a time. And of course, again, reiterating that it is the last resort option for adaptation. This is the institutional arrangement of the when we assess a case of that needs relocation, it's an institutional setup working closely with other ministries and other development partners and other NGOs. But there's a set process. There's a task force in place, the Fijian Task Force on Relocation and Displacement, that looks at these cases and then sends a joint team to do the various analysis that's required to ascertain where a community falls. So again, like I said, this is the local mechanism that we use. A community request comes in. If it's depending on the type of community, we have formal settlements, informal settlements, and registered villages. So these are what we mean by the three community types. And depending on the type of request, all the request comes through is eventually to the divisional commissioner's office before it's forwarded to the task force to call a sitting of committee members and then assess whether urgent action is needed if the risk level is high. When we do the comprehensive risk vulnerability assessment using a tool that we have now in place, it assesses the risk thresholds of communities. If a community meets a certain level of risk thresholds, and then we confirm that relocation is an option, then it goes forward for further discussion as a relocation case. If it's identified that there's still other possibilities of preserving the community, and then we will look at those other options. And if it's a development related issue, which in a lot of cases it's also identified during field inspections that it's related to drainage issues, some poor development issues, then it's forwarded to the concerned ministries to address that. So within this process, the last stage is the monitoring and evaluation. Once you've gone through all of that, you've relocated the community, the monitoring and evaluation is to ensure that the grievance redress mechanisms and all the other principles embedded into the planning process has taken, is adhered to and to ensure compliance. As well as reviewing the status of the community, that they're able to sustain their livelihoods, they're able to thrive in the new site. So this is the last stage, the monitoring and evaluation, learning and sharing experiences. So what we're already doing with this, we bring communities that have already been relocated with communities that are going to be relocated to have these shared experiences on what could have worked better. And then that all of those lessons learned are fed by the government, are used by the government to feed into improving these processes as part of our monitoring and evaluation framework. This is a work in progress. We expect to take on board some more lessons learned that may come up as we continue to develop in this work, as more relocation efforts continue. We expect some other lessons that can be incorporated to strengthen this process. And we have a monitoring and evaluation framework and tool that's now in place. So that's the last part of our standard operating procedure. And similarly, for the other work on adaptation, it's got an M&E process that's embedded in it, with the essential goal of picking up what's working, what's not, where are the gaps, how can we improve things going forward. And then there are other subsidiary work happening to also support that work. For example, we have a climate relocation communities trust fund that's seed funded by the Fijian government. And then there's a certain pool of revenue that's established called the climate, our environment and climate levy, ECAL. So the ECAL pool of revenue is charged on high emitting services and high carbon emitting services and industries in Fiji. So that pool of fund, a certain percentage of that is channeled towards the crop trust fund, which finances adaptation activities and relocation work in the communities, and that can be topped up by other bilateral support. So that's the system we have in place to seed fund this work. And we have an adaptation projects tracker to sort of track the ongoing initiatives that's happening right now before you catalog them once project is completed. So thank you very much. That's pretty much what I wanted to update the forum on this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lemba, for that presentation, which was actually, it covered, I think, the national framework, and some very important tools at all levels, the adaptation registry, the M&E framework, and then I think very importantly, the guidelines that have been prepared for displacement and relocation. So I think it gives a very holistic picture about how the monitoring and evaluation learning components are embedded within the entire sort of national planning and adaptation monitoring system. So I mean, thanks a lot for that. I think there'll be a lot of interest and questions in your presentation. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to a very different presentation. Next, I'd like to first introduce Dr. Kei Kurushima, who's a policy researcher at Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, IGES. Dr. Kurushima has received her PhD in international cooperation and has more than 10 years experience in the field of rural development and environment issues for Southeast Asia. And she's currently working for climate change adaptation in Asia Pacific. So I'm going to now turn to her to make her presentation.
Okay, so is my screen okay?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction. I am Kei Kurushima, and I would like to make a presentation with the title Introduction of National Adaptation MEL System in Japan and the Way Forward with LLA. I'm working for a research institute, and I'm working on international adaptation project, but I would like to present the MEL system of Japan based on document analysis, and then introduce some international work of Japan on MEL system of adaptation. So this is a brief overview of my presentation. First, I would like to introduce the MEL system of Japan in both national and subnational level. And secondly, also explain about Japan's international cooperation in adaptation with a focus on LLA. And finally, I would like to introduce the future possibilities of linking MEL with LLA. So about the national and subnational adaptation MEL in Japan, it is written in Japan's climate change adaptation plan that monitoring and evaluating the progress on adaptation while managing the progress by setting KPIs on sectoral fundamental measures and setting indicators from the perspective of making climate change adaptation firmly established and more widespread at national, local, and citizen levels based on PDCA cycle. So here the KPIs or key performance indicators is priority indicators aimed at tracking the short-term progress of the government's adaptation efforts. And they are used to measure the degree of achievement of the targets and relevant measures in as much as a quantitative manner as possible. For the PDCA cycle, we have an adaptation policy cycle. It consists of impact assessments, planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation, and formulate adaptation plans. Although the MEL system has been established in this way at the national level, there is still challenges for integrating LLA into MEL system Japan, which the MEL system local level is not developed much, including the concreteness of the system. So next, I would like to introduce some MEL system in the subnational levels of Japan. From what I have researched, it appears that the system has not yet been established at the civil society or community level, but rather in provincial and city level. And there are more than 100 local adaptation plans in Japan in the level of city and province. And each adaptation plan has progress indicators and M&E system. Some examples of progress indicators are listed here. Some are like percentage of municipalities that have a plan to promote adaptation measures, number of times information on climate change adaptation is disseminated to the public, or like number of people participating in a forestation project, or like percentage of people who are prepared for disasters, flood hazard map establishment rate, and so on. I have picked up a few, but there's a lot of many progress indicators in the subnational and local level as well. And for the MEL systems in province and city level, most of them use the PDCA cycle of the National Adaptation M&E system, but some cities, prefectures use their original M&E system. And I picked up two examples from Kashiwa City, it's near Tokyo in Chiba province, and Nagoya, it's in the center of Japan in Aichi prefecture. In Kashiwa City, it established the Kashiwa Environmental Management System to manage the progress of municipal projects that require environmental considerations. And for Nagoya City, they have indicators of goals and indicators of target achievement. And these analyze the cause of delay and respond by reviewing measures. So if I sum up the national and subnational M&E of Japan, in terms of integrating MEL and LLA, this has only begun to be implemented in some pioneering prefectures and cities, and further support and concrete reflection in the national plans for LLA is still needed, yes. So this was the brief introduction of MEL system in Japan. And next, I would like to introduce Japan's international cooperation in adaptation with focus on LLA. So first of all, let me explain about APPLAT, which is Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Information Platform. And APPLAT is a partner collaboration initiatives of adaptation established in 2019 by the Ministry of the Environment Japan and other relevant organizations in Asia Pacific, including IGES. And APPLAT aims to strengthen regional partnership for promoting climate change adaptation by establishing a one-stop comprehensive information platform, identifying opportunities for comprehensive strategies, and launching new projects to create information tools and initiatives for capacity development. In APPLAT, we have three pillars, which are tool development, scientific information, and capacity development. We work on these three pillars, and we also work on the relations between these three pillars with partner collaboration with the relevant organizations. So since APPLAT is an important platform for international cooperation in the field of adaptation in Japan, it is very important to see how the LLA and MEL systems are addressed here. And we are now working on these issues, but for the new update of APPLAT, we have developed framework for action 2023-2024, and this was made after the discussion at the plenary meeting on February 14 this year. And in this framework, we have identified 6 important issues to be focused on in the next 3 years. And LLA, number 2, practice locally led adaptation, and number 4, monitoring and evaluation. Although these are written in a different category, they are addressed here as an important issue of APPLAT. So LLA is very important for APPLAT and the policy for international cooperation in Japan. And we have already been working on LLA project under APPLAT, which is called APN, IGES Project on Locally Led Adaptation. So IGES is working with APN, Asia Pacific Network for Global Change Research in Japan. And under this project, we support the understanding of climate risks and vulnerabilities at the local level, and support locally led adaptation innovations, stressing the use of indigenous, traditional, and local knowledge systems, and support bankable ideas toward establishing local adaptation innovation hubs, and strengthen local adaptation planning, implementation, and government systems to ensure inclusiveness, participation, transparency, and better localization of NAPs and NDCs. So this project has just started consultation with partner organizations, and which we provide network resources and advice to them so that they can create tools and methods, expertise, and cross-learnings of good experiences in each community, where Japan's adaptation efforts, lessons, practices will be inputted here, and the outcomes of this project, which are guidelines and tools on local adaptation planning and implementation will be shared on AP Plat, so that the people can refer to them in the website of AP Plat. So I have briefly explained about the national and local adaptation and focusing on MEL system. And for my conclusion, I would like to mention that although Japan has MEL system for national adaptation, there is still challenges for integrating LLA into this system. And the lessons learned from local government and through international projects that has developed their own MEL system can be shared broadly. And for future development, developing tools for monitoring and evaluation by integrating local needs and lessons in these tools can be suggested, both in local areas of Japan and in local communities of the world with the International Cooperation Project of Japan. Okay, so thank you for your attention. And this is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Kurishima. I think that provided a very good perspective on the subnational monitoring and evaluation system in a couple of provinces, but also the overall monitoring and evaluation the system that is being built at the national level. But as you mentioned, there are challenges to integrating locally led adaptation, but it shows examples of how to move in that direction. Also, it's good to know that the AP Plat will be upgraded and is already available for countries to provide the information around the 3 pillars. So I think that's a very, very useful to know. So I think without further ado, I'm going to move on to our next panelist, Mr. Desagan Naidu, who's a World Bank Senior Advisor and Climate Adaptation Lead for the South African Presidential Commission. He's also a Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Security Studies and the President of the Global Non-Governmental Organization for Human Right to Water and a founding member of the Water Policy Group. He has led the Water Research Commission, South Africa's dedicated national water and sanitation innovation, research and development agency, for 10 years. So I'd like to now turn to him for his perspective.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to my colleagues for incredibly interesting presentations on Fiji and Japan and the Asia Pacific. Like Bangladesh, like Fiji, like Japan, I come from a part of the world that has for a long time had to deal with the vagaries of weather-related disasters. In fact, from the beginnings of its civilization. And the reality of living in a part of the world that is simultaneously hit by huge droughts, and 2/3 of the country that I live in is in fact a semi-desert, and at the same time being the victim of barreling storms on the East Coast. You will know that Cyclone Freddy has been roaming around our part of the world for more than a month now. It may be the longest surviving cyclone in modern history. And such is the energy inside the system on the back of our already increased temperature of plus 1.1 degrees above the pre-industrial levels, one can only imagine what is going to be at 2 degrees and 3 degrees and even higher. Colleagues, I am not sharing a PowerPoint presentation to you. I thought we were going to do this in a slightly different format, and I will make sure that you have some notes and point you to some material. I wanted to start at a slightly different point around what is driving the strategy overall in South Africa and now in many other parts of the world, and how does that relate to MEL? So one of the dominant paradigms, certainly, that has taken over the system, at least since COP27, although the concept has been around for quite a long time, has been this notion of a just transition. And this has become the dominant narrative vehicle that we are now using, and I think it's a very useful one. And people have used this in various ways. In South Africa, which is one of the few countries in the global south that actually has very high per capita carbon dioxide emissions, our starting point has been the flagship of the energy transition in my country. And the just energy transition, called very specifically, is underlined by the just transition framework that is being used to drive this forward. And I should point out that this is something that's been adopted by a very wide range of countries around the world. And I want to locate locally led adaptation, and of course the MEL that goes with locally led adaptation inside that framework, because I think it's something that is really important. So the first pillar of the framework, the first justice in the framework, is the whole notion of procedural justice. Can you organize for the movement in the way you do your climate resilience strategies, your mitigation strategies, and your adaptation strategies in a way that organizes to not only invite the participation of all of the stakeholders in the system, but to agentize those stakeholders right across the board in a way that does not only allow them to participate in the decision-making, but also in the implementation of those decisions across the board. And this is really, really critical. For far too long, we have all been recipients, particularly in the global south, of teams of people who come and offer technical expertise and do an intervention, and the intervention happens and is sometimes successful, and they go away and there's no sustainability in the system. You do not want to be left carrying the can in the same way around climate change. So procedural justice on top of the agenda. The second issue associated with that is, where in the system are you going to get a maximized participation to achieve this procedural justice? And the reality is that local levels, however you define that local, is the place where this best happens. It is a place where people have a history with one another. It is a place where you have an injection of, I guess, accountability, because people don't often move out of those environments. And so you have, if you like, the arithmetic that you need to indeed organize yourself around a procedural justice being achieved. The second justice that we have to engage is the issue of distributive justice. Are we going to organize this in a way that all of the players in the system actually become beneficiaries of the intervention? Again, we have far too many examples in many, many sectors of where this is far from the case, where you have a group of beneficiaries, usually a minority, that have the biggest part of the cake, and the crumbs are distributed among the rest. So distributive justice actually becomes a very key part of this. And once again, the local level organizes for you to be able to have the better mechanisms to achieve it, because many of the integrations that we seek actually happen at the local level spontaneously, while they have to be engineered at national levels and supranational levels. The third element of justice is restorative justice. Throughout the world, and here I'm not sure there are any exceptions in the global north, local communities generally get the bitter end of the stick. Local communities in general have coming to them a whole range of benefits that have not been realized. Many parts of the world come out of colonial regimes, like my country does, and my country has the added measure of coming out of a segregated regime in the form of apartheid, which was declared as a crime against humanity. So in the way we engage this transition to low carbon economies, this transitions in adapting to climate change, these transitions to mitigate further climate change, we must ensure that restorative justice is one of the mainstays that we move forward with. So what this means is in the way you design and implement your monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems, they have to carry this paradigm through that. And I'm sure maybe we'll have a few questions about that when we have our Q&A. Let me switch to the architecture of the system inside South Africa currently. And here I have to admit that a slide or two would certainly have helped. And maybe I should put some up and send it to you to be part of the conference report. So at the broadest level, South Africa organizes itself to express itself in the supranational fora, well, the most famous of which is the UNFCCC and the Nationally Determined Contribution, the NDC, the latest NDC from South Africa, is its first that is actually within the Paris Agreement, and we're quite proud of that. At a local level, this is all being empowered by something called Climate Bill. This is a piece of legislation that is currently in the House. It has a pretty good chance of being promulgated into an act in 2023. And it has some very specific things that it wants to roll out. And I'll talk about that very briefly. But the flagship of the Just Energy Transition, which is the thing that is organizing for most of the new investments around the switch to low carbon economies in our part of the country, is something that is, if you like, being the icebreaker. And the adaptation agenda is following very rapidly to organize together with mitigation to get us into the resilience scenario. And there are quite a few things that we are doing around engaging that. But first, let me unpack the Climate Bill. One of the important things in that Climate Bill, soon to become a Climate Act, that demands of the various players in the system, which will empower that MEL, is in fact a series of adaptation policies, strategies, and plans at all levels of the system. So in the South African system, we will have to have sectoral plans, many of which are already in the process of being conceptualized, some of which are already in operation and have been for a little while, driven by other factors like trade barrier anxieties in the form of CBAMs, as an example. So there will be sectoral strategies in the system that are formalized in addition to the ones that are already there. And then we will have adaptation strategies at various levels. The formulation of the national one has already been done. South Africa has a national climate change adaptation strategy, and several cities and towns have also organized themselves to have adaptation strategies as we speak. And the latest in that suite are at district level. These are the sub-town levels, if you like. So the municipalities that are largely characterized by villages and a rural domain. And we want to have this blanket to blank coverage of the entire system so that there is a moving balkanization and empowerment at the most local level around getting us into the space of the climate adaptation that we clearly need. And then supporting this are the non-formal structures that are helping to make this happen as well. One of those examples, and I think a very important one, is the South African mayors, and these are mayors of all towns and cities in the country, organize themselves around something called SALGA, the South African Local Government Association. And SALGA, as of its last round, beginning last year, now has a mayoral working group on climate resilience and environmental management, which is making it their job to see this through in a powerful way. I myself come from the Presidential Climate Commission, and the Presidential Climate Commission, as its name suggests, sits in the presidency of the country. And also in that presidency is a new Ministry of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation. And so the link around MEL has now not only become automatic, but I think seriously empowered. And it's worth pointing out that this location in the presidency means some very powerful things for what we're able to do in the climate adaptation domain. The first of those things is that we already are developing an M&E framework, and the Presidential Climate Commission has a special working group of commissioners that apply themselves only to M&E. And that M&E framework is in an advanced stage of preparation, and it's already identified what its flagship product is going to be. And South Africa will, hopefully, in 2024, perhaps even 2023, if we get moving even more quickly, is to develop a state of climate report for the country. And this will be a flagship report that reports across sectors, across various subnational domains around the state of where we are in comparison with the pledges that we have made and the targets we have developed for ourselves. And this is going to be a very important tool because apart from being a tool available for practitioners, which is critical, it also is a political tool for a political discussion about where we are and the kinds of investments that we need to make. So in the minutes and a bit I have left, let me conclude with this. That this notion of just transition, we are engaging at various levels in the system. So we are launching this year a just urban transition strategy around how we're going to deal with transitions in climate at an urban level. We are also simultaneously organizing to launch a just rural transition strategy because there are many, many things that need to happen in the rural domains that are absolutely critical. We are also using our climate disasters as a catalytic point. You know, the issues that were raised in the other two presentations, I think, are very absorbing. So in our case, we're using floods in the form of the rain bomb that the KwaZulu-Natal province experienced last year, and it was absolutely incredible. We had close to 500 people losing their lives. It's quite unprecedented in such a big developed city. And we have another giant metro in our country, Nelson Mandela Bay, that is in its 7th year of drought. So using the engagement around the disaster management in these domains and several others in the country, we're moving from the disaster management paradigm into the disaster risk reduction as the natural flow on around rebuild and recovery to ensure that the rebuild and recovery is in fact filled with adaptation and other measures to ensure that the climate resilience coefficient of those areas are much higher than they used to be. We want to have the reverse of what was shown in the Fiji slide. We don't want the seawalls to be receding into the land. We want to have the ability to push them out once again. And then together with mitigation and this adaptation, we want to engage this new notion of climate resilient development strategies. This is drawn from the CRDP concept that was in the 6th assessment report, in particular the Working Group 2 report, as something we want to take forward inside the system. And needless to say, the thing that organizes for the targeting, the thing that organizes for the motivation, the thing that organizes for us to share enough to be able to know how to do it better each time, and the thing that, of course, keeps us honest is the monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework that we put into place to support this. Chair, I will stop at that point and very happy to engage in the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Naidu. I think you covered a lot of ground. I think firstly, you covered the importance of the sort of framework of just transition, across not just energy, but also the transformation towards the end of your presentation on the urban transition, as well as the rural transitions that need to take place, and sort of like the justice framework that is important for locally led action. You also covered the architecture of adaptation strategies, national, subnational, district level, and also some of the sort of key considerations around both these. I mean, I think it's also fair to say that trying to have that state of climate report for South Africa is also going to be a key sort of a moment of a snapshot in terms of progress. But it just also shows how that it's not a simple issue in terms of really trying to plan for the transition and plan for adaptation quite differently, and in a way that is involving local people. So, and I think that's your presentation really showed also the kind of architecture that is needed. But it's quite an institutional process that is taking place, and I think there will be obviously a lot of questions as to how this is. Like sort of the push behind having this kind of architecture, because it's really important for countries to prepare in this way. I think what I wanted to do is, maybe give, there are three very, very different presentations. I think one on the oceans, context, which was presented by Ms. Lemba, which is really at the front lines of climate change. And then Dr. Kurushima presented the experience of Japan, the institutional framework, as well as the international efforts of Japan. And then, Mr. Naidu, you covered the South African experience. So I'm going to let, I think, everyone digest that for a little bit and encourage some, questions in the chat, which I can then direct to various speakers. But just to get the ball rolling, I'm going to just maybe pose, like a question each to each of our presenters. But then I don't intend to dominate the discussion with my questions. I think we'd certainly like to get more questions. And I've seen already a couple on the chat, I think, which is excellent. So I'm going to go to you, Ms. Lemba. I do hope it's okay. I'm not using your full name because it's I don't want to mispronounce it. So I wanted to go to you because, you presented, I think, very interesting set of, GIS tools, monitoring tools, and also the impact, tools. And I was wondering about those, in terms of how, I think, like, my question would be, what are, some of the, kind of lessons learned from engaging local communities and local actors on this, on these tools, because I guess that there is quite a lot of data, that needs to be fed into, at least the adaptation impact assessment, and it has to really benefit the communities because, as you mentioned, this MEL system, I mean, it is really meant to, really kind of benefit the communities and to see, how they can sort of move forward. So what are some of the challenges and barriers that you that have been there, and what has been the experience of engaging local communities? Over to you. Yeah, Ms. Lema, we'll come back to you in I think once you've had a couple of minutes, I think, to move. I'm going to go to Dr. Kurushima, and I'm going to ask, from your experience and knowledge, to what extent is locally led adaptation for monitoring, evaluation, learning been incorporated into the national system? Because in your presentation, you did share the couple of provinces that are working on this. So it would be good to know, how this is interacting with your national system for the adaptation planning. Over to you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I have introduced some points in my presentation, but there still needs some effort in incorporating the local adaptation for MEL into national monitoring system in Japan. I think the point is that the local government is still following the system of the national government as the way it is, and except for the few local governments such as Kashiwa and Nagoya that I have explained in my presentation. And so that I think the local government has to develop a system on their own so that it suits the local situations. And since IGIS is working on a capacity development project in the developing countries, I have learned from Nepal that the country establishes the authority for local government to operate as the responsible entity for local planning and development with national plans, policies, and other guidelines. So the central government has developed and provided self-assessment tools for the local government. And I think these bottom-up local government activities in these developing countries, I think these advanced efforts, Japan can also learn from them. And yes, I think we still need some efforts in the future. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kurushima. I think that's a very candid, I think, view on the fact that this is a learning process, across the region, that means that at the local level, the need for information needs to be more simplified and must be useful for people on the ground, whereas sometimes at the national level the needs might be different, for directing at a different scale the policy. I am going to try again to go back to Ms. Lemba to see if we could if your sound is working now, so you could come in.
Yeah, hi. We're talking about the first one, sharing experiences on locally led adaptation for MEL, incorporated into national monitoring systems. Correct?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you specifically about these tools that are being used, the adaptation impact tools, and also all the GIS tools which are overlaying the socioeconomic information. So how are local communities being engaged in that, and how are they benefiting from it, or what are the experiences so far of engaging them in this process?
Yes, so they're engaged in several processes. So one of it primarily is the in-situ adaptation surveys. So when we go out into the communities to collect data and work with them on identifying the adaptation interventions that's required from some of these most impacted sites, a lot of it falls into essentially three categories. So one of it is relating to some development related issues. So when we use GIS to capture, using Kobo toolbox to conduct our surveys, and then feed this information back into these decision support tools that's helping the government and the implementing ministries. So Climate Change Division working closely with the implementing ministries. These GIS tools are also part of embedded support. We have few partners. We have UNITA that's involved in creating some of these models, as well as working with local partners, the ministries that have authoritative data baselines that we can leverage to create these models on hazards and exposure, and then working with our Bureau of Statistics to get in the vulnerabilities and coping capacity indicators, as well as feed the information that's collected from these in-situ adaptation surveys with the communities. So when we are there with the communities, we of course go through that set of consultative participatory approach with them. That again, reiterating the point raised by Dr. Naidu earlier, those are one of the core elements of having that locally led approach, elements of participation and a very consultative approach with the communities when we're carrying out these surveys, to that they're informed on what this information will feed into and how this connects back to the policies that we are preparing and that we implement to guide these works across all the sectors, having that human-centered approach, ensuring that the community bottom-up perception is prioritized, that we get as feedback from these surveys. The interests of the communities are considered and lessons learned from past experiences are captured, and to ensure that the environmental issues and other issues relating to tensions over land, inadequate resources or unsuitable sites are considered in future applications when we try to implement similar projects in the communities, and also ensuring that that we ensure that what we're bringing to these communities would be sustainable, and that another reason why we have these community contributions as part of these plans is to ensure that that they have some sense of ownership in investing their resources and their time in the construction of this of these measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lemba. Just before I move to Mr. Segan, just a question, just to follow up on that. That the engagement of local people in this exercises, is it something they welcome? Is there a level of trust, or because sometimes in other contexts, there are surveys, but it's a lot of communities don't understand what the benefit will be for them. So maybe just to understand what are the enabling factors that promote this kind of engagement from them.
Sorry, that question was for who?
Yeah, it was actually for you because, it's a very specific context, and it's a sort of an island context. And, it's very interesting to know, that how communities are, why they're so engaged. I mean, clearly climate, is a huge issue there. So, there's no issue of convincing a community, but, what is their, what are the enabling factors that allows them to really engage in this surveys and things? Because in other contexts, communities do not feel it's useful to be part of a survey because they don't get any benefits from it. So, it should be good to know what are those factors which, foster that kind of cooperation.
Yeah, I think one of the key elements there is just having that sense of procedural justice, what our other panelists had mentioned earlier, procedural justice, distributed justice. So discussing these issues with them, normally, like in Fiji's case, I touched on an earlier example that I raised in the presentation. We have a local coordination channel. So any request that reaches government, it's community driven. So this is an essential. So government will respond if it's a community driven request. So we essentially, so from the offset, from the get go, it is already like a bottom up approach for government to come in and intervene and create, construct something in the community. It has to come from the community, and we have to have evidence that the community wanted this project to happen. So that also involves like a standardized form that we get the community elders to sign on, and that's confirmed through the relevant officers that these are the villages, the residents that reside in that community. If it touches on land, so it also has to confirm with our Lands and Fisheries Commission that the signatories are legit, that they are landowning units of that particular community. These are validated through those channels before it comes up to government to look at an issue and say, okay, we can attend to this. We have the consent of the community. Still, government does its due diligence to visit and confirm the issues that we are informed before we come up with the options. So the options are presented to the communities, and these are the pros and cons of these adaptation measures and then they will decide on. So that's a consultative process that is not only facilitated by the implementing ministry, it has to be facilitated by that channel. So there's an instituted channel that the communities respect, and that's the channel that government departments implementing projects in communities follow to come to the community, and vice versa. So it goes up and also, so top, bottom up, and also government follows the same process when we reach the community to ensure that they are on board with whatever project that we implement on the ground. The issues with grievances that may come up is when this channel is not followed, or there's some miscommunication in that process. So for example, for some partners that may go directly and work with the communities, and then there's issues that come up later that did not follow that process. Often, that misunderstanding can lead to some of the conflicting issues that government will later have to deal with and, try to address and negotiate around with these communities.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that very granular understanding. I think that's really sheds light on really that it's not the monitoring process has a lot of issues of that bottom up, top down cycle, and also the importance of consent and information and things like that, which are really built into making a monitoring, evaluation, learning process effective. I'd like to turn to Mr. Desagan now. And I wanted to actually ask you, I think, a couple of questions. I think that the first question would be, given the architecture that you have, and the principles that you laid out, where do you think, the monitoring, evaluation, and learning sort of, comes into that architecture? What are those mechanisms? Because I think, as you said, the framework should be of justice, but I think the governments use their own sort of mechanisms for that monitoring, evaluation, learning, and so that's one part. Where does the MEL aspect fit into this framework? And secondly, what are the considerations that financiers and international development agencies should build into their funding modalities and design of investments, to support this kind of transition and also adaptation implementation. So two other large questions for you. And let me turn to you now.
Thanks, Rini, for that. If you don't mind, I want to make just a brief comment about the issue of communities and the engagement with communities. And one of the things that we're dealing with right now, and I guess the jury's still out as where it's going to land eventually, but there are two mechanisms that we often don't put enough attention to when we're talking about engagement with people to create a larger team. The first of those is that you do have to deal with the difficult issues upfront. I mean, right now, today, as we speak, we have a workshop with organized labor in our country, and we're going to have to discuss with them the difficult issue around the collateral damage that's going to happen to the mining industry and the coal industry in the wake of this just transition. It's a very, very hard discussion. But if you avoid that discussion, the skepticism simply continues, that you're doing something on the surface and you're not being sincere around what you want to engage. Where that will land, I can't tell you. Where we'd like it to land, I can't tell you. But we have to engage the very difficult discussions. And in the domain of climate change, this issue of relocation becomes that impossibly difficult discussion. Like Bangladesh, South Africa has for many, many years in advance of the flood seasons tried to get people relocated from certain settlements. It never works. And we have to find new and interesting ways and empowering ways to make that happen. The second is to build resident capacity. And borrowing from my previous avatar with the Water Research Commission, one of the things we invested in a lot was citizen science and various projects around weather monitoring, around organizing to monitor the health of your river systems with very simple tools in a supported atmosphere. And that starts to build up this team of community members, as opposed to them just being subjects that you have to deal with around making a particular policy work in a particular place. But to your specific questions, and they're very good questions, but they require workshops in their own right, I think. Let me start with the financiers and the IFIs and various other investors. This is something that we're working quite strongly at right now, together with the global community, because there are these international partnership groups now around various climate interventions in various parts of the world. South Africa was the first, but close to Bangladesh, places like Vietnam are now gearing up in very big ways to engage this, and many, many countries have that on the table. And one of the things that's popping out in all of those discussions is the risk associated with investment. And there are many reactions to it. I mean, the World Bank has recently completed a series of studies and published them in reports called the CCDRs, the Climate Change Diagnostic Reports, around how you engage the issues of risk into your investment portfolio, and then the switch to very different kinds of investments inside that system. Around the local disasters, the insurance companies are becoming much more active in the research space, and maybe eventually we can lure them into mitigation and adaptation investment spaces as well. So right now it's a difficult space because the withdrawal of investment is the first reaction that you're actually seeing all over the world. But we have to do enough to turn that around into an investment, into a shared future, because we all share this future. That a more resilient world is the one we are going to have the opportunity to survive in. And a less resilient world means that you better hope that Elon Musk is right and you actually can live on Mars. So that conversation is happening in a very serious way. And in the instruments that South Africa is using for that discussion right now is the implementation plan around the transition. And this is currently in consultation. It's a 1.5 trillion rand plan for the first 5 years. And the discussions we're having with the investment community and the banking community, and in general, the insurance and risk communities, is already becoming a fairly decent one. But it's a difficult pathway to go. And I see on your list, you have someone from the ADB also attending today, and maybe they'll have a few words to add to this. On the issue of the MEL being built into the system, that's always easier said than done, because no matter how far you push it, people look at the M&E part as the end of pipe engagement. So we're already starting to build inside the strategies, those elements of strategies that automatically organize themselves to be part of the eventual monitoring and evaluation. But you also have to have a monitoring and evaluation project in its own right running in parallel. Otherwise, this is not going to happen. So we're engaging in a series of diagnostic studies and pulse indicator studies all along the way of these different larger engagements, so that you pull out those pulse indicators all along the way and use those pulse indicators to then have a relearning inside the system. So the concept of the master class for various categories of people is something that is becoming quite popular. So masterclass for practitioners, masterclass for decision makers, masterclasses for community leaders are the mechanisms where if you build these communities of practice in a smart enough way, then you're moving in the right kind of direction. The assist that we get from technology and AI is going to be invaluable. I mean, we already have major GIS projects running, very similar to what you saw in the Fiji presentation. But beyond that, we're investing a lot in modeling and AI around projections, and then revisiting that in feedback loops around understanding it a lot better to see how that augments strategy as you move forward, how that augments investment as you move forward. The reality for the monitoring, evaluation, and learning community of practice is you have to be overt and loud. And this is not a characteristic of this community of practice. This community of practice generally wants to observe quietly. Well, some of us must observe quietly. Others of us have to be very loud and be front and center to those discussions. Otherwise, we're going to end up in difficult spaces where you'd have 5 years of an implementation that gives you a poor result, and then you have to redesign that, and you can't get back those 5 years. So those feedback loops actually become critically important. The last thing that I want to put on the table is that we have to, and we're discussing this a lot in a supranational group called the ICCN. This is the International Climate Councils Network, and currently it's 23 countries, and I'm sure it will grow. This concept of just adaptation is a core concept that we're carrying inside that group. But the thing that we're making quite clear is that we have to visualize very rapidly for everyone that the world of tomorrow in a low carbon economy, in a more climate resilient economy, is actually quite different from where we are now. And that for some folk, there is a reskilling pathway that is going to be available and that will be convenient. For many others, they're completely new jobs for which there is no reskilling pathway, but a whole new education trajectory, skilling trajectory to be able to manage those climate resilient economies. And I think visualizing that early on from where we are is a better way to get to that place. So within that, the MEL system will find its place as well. I'll pause there. Thanks, Rini.
Thanks very much, Mr. Desagan. I think, very, as you said, a MEL community needs to be, tends to keep its head on the ground sometimes, in terms of thinking it's a technical issue, which it is, but it requires to be built in from the beginning and to make sure that we're not coming to a point where results were not necessarily in the right direction or resulted in some sort of another maladaptive kind of response. I'm going to keep us, I think the time is open. We have very few minutes left, but I have been with Kiyomi monitoring the chat. I think there was one question from Melanie Pisano, but that was, I think, already answered by Ms. Lemba. So I just want to check if there's any other reflection or question anyone would like to come in. Please raise your hand.
Do you think I could ask a question?
Well, absolutely, Mr. And I do. Actually, we just have one question, though, before I go to you. Okay. That's actually for Dr. Kuroshima. Just to check, I think, whether AP Plat will capture traditional indigenous knowledge, and any sort of the learning aspects in that MEL framework. Or in a case study or in any other form. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. For the current time being, we don't have a learning for the traditional knowledge, but I think it is important to learn together with LLA, the traditional knowledge. So maybe in the future, like near future, we might develop like some kind of e-learning or maybe a project in developing countries. And so we just started the partner collaboration on AP Plus. So any ideas on the new project is welcome. So yeah, I'm looking forward to developing some kind of LLA or traditional knowledge project. Yeah.
Thank you. I think thank you for that future opportunity. Let me go to Mr. Desagan. Please, your question or reflection is very welcome. Over to you.
Thank you. Firstly, let me introduce my colleague, Michelle Hasteman, who's also from the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa. She's recently joined and she has vast expertise in this domain. And I'm sure we'll want to make some contributions as well. But my question is for Fiji, actually. And it's a bit of a left field question. I mean, as an island state, and island states are, if you like, at the front end of this climate storm, clearly, I can see how it would be easy to convince people that action is required and action is required urgently. But I'm curious about the level of anxiety in such communities, because it must be extraordinarily high, because while the rest of us are philosophical about this existential crisis, for island states, this is very real. And I'm curious as to how you deal with that and how you make that work so that you move forward in a reasonably good direction while carrying people with you. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you, Dr. Naidu. Just to respond to that, so we have like a lot of communities that, in Fiji's, I think, second national communication to UNFCCC, there's about more than 800 communities that are listed under vulnerable, climate impacted communities that are impacted by both climate change and disasters. But that's like a very big list of communities that suffers to some degree impacts of climate change. Because there's so many communities, because we are an island state, and most of the, I think about 70% of residential areas, inhabited villages and settlements are along the coast. So obviously, there's a lot of risks to do with coastal inundation and such. So again, it comes to one of the points that you raised earlier in terms of distributed justice. So we have this comprehensive risk vulnerability assessment tool that is to ascertain. So we go through a 10-step process to evaluate the level of risks in terms of like their exposure to hazards and to the various multiple hazards, and then how resilient are the communities in terms of where their standings are in terms of vulnerabilities and coping capacities. This is not only to identify areas where specific vulnerability indicators should be strengthened, where we can reduce vulnerabilities and enhance their coping capacities, but also to justify how we rated these communities. So we have like a combination of scientific and as well as the questionnaire that we evaluate any community that requests for adaptation or relocation support from the government will have to be evaluated against that survey, and that helps the government justify why a certain community was selected. So it helps with basically what the government wanted was a risk ranking tool to justify their selection of certain communities. So it's not, because of course, the media will always say, why was this community, this one looks more vulnerable? How is this one selected over those ones? So yeah, we have to have like a scientific basis and a strong climate rationale for selecting certain adaptation interventions in certain sites. And again, with the worst case scenario with relocation, if a community is ranked highly, it's highly risky, and they do not want to relocate, we cannot relocate them. We'll have to go with communities that want relocation, that have, we've got the evidence and the consent that this is the measure that they want. All the other ones, we'll have to explore other adaptation measures like periodic dredging, or what is it, like raising some houses on stilts. In some cases, it's partial relocation or reclamation of land, or some other type of coastal protection. So those are some of the interventions that we discuss with them, and then we work through those options. And then the academics, the scientists and engineers and academics from our universities sit with the government through validation workshops to screen these recommendations that we take out to the communities, and to give us their views on why it'll work, why it won't work for certain communities and such. So it's like a combined effort.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lemba. I think you're showing that there's a very systemic approach to a very anxious and stressful process, I can imagine, for both the communities and the government. We are actually almost now out of time. I have one hand up, and I think that's from one of our participants, Michelle, perhaps. If you could please come and introduce yourself, and if you could make it brief, it would be good to hear a reflection, and then I'm going to do a short sum up and close. Over to you. Over to you, Michelle. You might need to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry, it wasn't allowing me to unmute. I apologize for that.
No.
I realize we're out of time, so I'll just keep it short. I'm Michelle Heasterman, introduced me from South Africa. And I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to hear about actual implementation and how challenging it can be in the moving of people, and just to raise the profile of, a lot of our MEL starts to look at quantitative factors, number of people engaged, number of people moved, but what are the agentive or the agency indicators that people have? What are the motivational qualitative indicators of that change, and to raise the profile of that as something that doesn't only come at the end, but is ongoing, to enhance the learning that's going on, and to also capture that learning. So I just wanted to thank everybody, because it's something we really struggle with, because the problem is the financing of monitoring and evaluation is often an afterthought, and there's a lot of work that goes into starting to capture those stories of success. So we have to make sure that it comes in and is well financed, so that we are making sure that there are people on the ground to measure that and to interview. That was my last comment, and thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you, Michelle, for that reflection. I think that's like telling the stories as much as the data, and the stories, and also of the action and the agency of people. I think that's important to build in. It's not very easy to do in the current sort of systems, but I think that's the main takeaway from that. I'm going to request everyone to put their cameras on, because the organizer would like to take a snapshot of everyone who's participated. So with for all who are comfortable, please put your cameras on so we can take a picture. Okay, is that okay? The organizers, do you have let us know? Please let us know when you're done, so that I can close the session soon.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I think a huge thank you to everyone, our panelists, and also the reflections. I think just a couple of takeaway points. Clearly, I think what we've heard is they're actually on the ground experiences at different levels. So it's not off monitoring and evaluation learning within certain, frameworks of the national adaptation strategies, sub-national strategies, and also within the framework of just transition. In one of our examples, so there are clearly, the actual, cases that are in motion that countries can learn from each other. I think also, we've seen that in all cases, the MEL starts right at the beginning and not at the end. I think that it's a very active, most of the examples show a very active process of subnational governments particularly. And in some cases, communities are participating. In some cases, there still needs to be much bigger boost to have that participation. And there are examples of adaptation indicators and tools such as impact assessments and others. So it's not, it's not no longer purely academic process. There is a discussion going on the Global Goal for Adaptation globally about aggregation, but clearly there's a lot of work happening at the country level, enough to provide a picture, of progress for communities at the country level, but much more needs to be done to make it really useful to communities that are actually on the front lines. And a lot of the tools that were shown are really around that. But there's a lot that needs to be done, because there are trade-offs in lots of the solutions, and there are some very sensitive issues like relocation and displacement and others that would need to be built in. So it's not a purely, it is a political process, and there needs to be dedicated, I would say, projects or funding support required just for making sure that the MEL process is and the programs are, there's actually some teeth behind it, that there are actually facilities to activate it. And there is also, I think, regional platforms that are available that can support countries in moving forward. So I really want to thank all the panelists hugely for the deep dive into their countries, and to Kiyomi for organizing this session. And it's been my pleasure really to learn from this. And to everyone, I believe it's going to be on YouTube. So, we'll be able to disseminate it to a larger audience. So with that, thank you to all panelists, and look forward to remaining connected with all of you. Goodbye.